All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today to hear about the Upper Yellowstone Watershed study. It's great to have you here. This is a really important topic. Just a little bit of housekeeping, everyone, please, if you don't mind staying on mute to minimize distractions, and we will reserve some time at the end for Q&A, so please hold your questions until that time. We have quite a bit of information to get through. My name is Max Yortsberg. I'm the Managing Director of Park County Environmental Council, and here at PCEC, we work with our community to safeguard the land, water, wildlife, and people, Yellowstone's Northern Gateway, through grassroots organizing and community advocacy. Water has always been an important part of our work. I'm not sure how many noticed, I'm sure many of you have, but last summer the Yellowstone River ran at, I believe, the second lowest flow on record. In the area we were in experienced drought conditions for most of the summer, and it was noticeable. That raises the questions, what, if anything, could or should have been done in response, and where do we even begin? And they're not really easy questions to answer, and I think that's why this recently completed Upper Yellowstone Watershed study is and will be really invaluable for our community. Like any other study of this size and caliber, it was years in the making. Back in 2017, the Yellowstone River Symposium was held here in Livingston. I helped Wendy Weaver with Montana Freshwater Partners and Ashley Lowry with the Upper Yellowstone Watershed Group organize the event in response to the 2016 fish kill that had occurred the previous summer. Two major concerns rose to the top of the wide-ranging group of attendees at that event: recreational use of the river and drought. And so out of that, the Upper Yellowstone group formed the drought focus group. Myself and several of us on this call have been actively participating in that group since we started. After we all did a crash course in what drought is and how it's defined and measured, we performed a risk assessment across sectors of the community so we could also determine how different groups of people and users could respond to drought. We came to one big realization, is that we needed data. And that's where today's guest speaker, John Lunzer, comes in. John is a hydrologist with the Department of Natural Resources and Conservation, works in the Water Sciences Bureau. He completed a master's degree at Montana Tech in 2019 and has worked in water resources in Montana for a total of 8 years now, the last 5 of which have been with the DNRC. His work focuses primarily on connections between irrigation and local hydrology. John is going to talk to us today about the study that he's been doing, which began in 2021 and was funded through a Bureau of Reclamation's Applied Science grant. The overarching goal was to construct a water balance that can be used to answer questions regarding where, when, and how much water is moving through the watershed, to evaluate future scenarios of water use, inform drought management plans, and forecast seasonal water supply in the watershed. Real quick, before I turn it over to John, I'd like to have Danielle Proctor, the new watershed coordinator for the Park County Conservation District, say a few words about the drought focus group and the work that we're all doing. Danielle, over to you.
Thank you, Max, for the introduction and the background information on the Drought Focus Group, which is a committee housed under the Upper Yellowstone Watershed Group. The Park Conservation District houses the Upper Yellowstone Watershed Group and the Shields Valley Watershed Group. In addition to the watershed groups, the Conservation District also handles all the 310 permitting within Park County. As Max mentioned, the Drought Focus Group has supported the work being done and that's being presented by DNRC today through meetings, producer connections, the assessment, and other funding. Recently, the Drought Focus Group published a report on our progress that can be found on the Upper Yellowstone Watershed website, upperyellowstone.org. Our website is also a great place to access our resources and sign up for our communications. With the completion of the Upper Yellowstone Watershed study, our next steps are to finalize a drought plan for the Upper Yellowstone and continue our stakeholder outreach based on the findings from the study. This will allow us to focus our efforts on areas that are shown to have a positive impact. We extend our gratitude to John, Rhea, and Sale and the team at DNRC for their efforts in completing this research and assisting in our next steps, as well as a big thank you to PCEC for gathering us here today. And with that, I'll pass it to John. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Danielle. Again, my name is John Lunzer. I'm a hydrologist of DNRC Water Sciences Bureau. If I accomplish my objectives today, you will be sick of me talking. We'll be done within the hour. You'll have learned something and you'll be excited for what is coming. So prepare to drink from a fire hose. And let me get this. There we go. So real quick, what is DNRC Water Sciences Bureau? And we don't have time to get in the weeds, but here's some of the things we do. So we run the state-owned stream gauge program at DNRC, which is gauges throughout the state that complement the USGS program. We do statewide modeling of physical availability. And this is Eastern Montana, Western Montana, all over the state. We support local groups, including conservation districts, watershed groups, irrigation districts, and many more. And we do things like basin studies, which is one you're going to see today, and things like practice studies where you look at different irrigation practices and things like that. And you can think of all of this as we use science to go help people. So in the context of Upper Yellowstone, where this kind of all started, so in 2016, there was a fish kill. This is a die-off of mountain whitefish. It was related to warm stream temperatures, lower flows, and PKD disease outbreak. So when this happened, there was a lot of finger pointing throughout the whole valley of what was causing this, who was doing it, how did water use relate to all of this. And it really brought up the need for, we need good data. We need to understand a water balance, and we'll talk about what that is. And we need to really understand how water's moving throughout the watershed to be able to understand how what's causing these issues and what can us people do about these issues. So that's where we get into the nitty gritty and the objectives. So really it is answering the how much, where, and when for water in the watershed. So, I mean, this is every piece of water, groundwater, surface water, irrigation water, human used water, all of those pieces. Where is it? When is it there? How much is being used? All of that. And so to do this, we have to construct a water balance. We're going to go through each of these bullets in a little more detail. We need to create a integrated model, which sounds intimidating, but it really isn't. We'll go through each piece of that, which is a runoff model and a systems model. And then producing forecast. And we'll kind of talk how this goal evolved with the study, but really let's understand our long-term water supply and our short-term forecasts and how those can be used as tools to address some of the issues in the watershed. And most important, and we'll talk about this, these models are a tool. So they're not just a report on a, gets thrown up on a bookshelf. They're going to allow us to do things, and we'll talk about what they can do. And this is what I would argue you should be the most excited about today, is having this tool set. So how do we accomplish all those? So right off the bat, the first thing is data collection. You can't do any modeling without good data. So evaluating what data exists in the valley, where the gaps are, where they need to be filled, what can be done, adding real-time monitoring, because as you'll see with the modeling, if you're not in real-time monitoring a lot of these pieces, you're not going to be able to push out a good forecast. Actually constructing the model, which we'll go into those pieces as well. And then the biggest piece, when you're doing modeling like this, you have to engage water users throughout the watershed. If you're just sitting at a desk modeling, you're not going to produce a useful product, right? You need to have on-the-ground validation. You need to have access to private land to collect that data. You need to have local knowledge, which you can bring in to support some of those efforts. And then finally, you need a team of water nerds, which they'll be highlighted later, because it's really some pretty high-end stuff. We're talking computer coding, really nerdy stuff that luckily you're not going to hear about today. So real quick funding, the need came, hey, we need to collect more data. We need more information. That takes money. So the main source of funding for this is a Bureau of Reclamation Applied Science grant that was started in 2023 was the funding period. And this really funded the monitoring. So purchase of equipment, as well as a field tech to go collect all that data. Other groups that supported were the Watershed Group, Arthur Blank, DNRC, and then in-kind contributions from a bunch of groups, FWP, Watershed Group, Montana Freshwater Partners, and PCEC. So here's a list. Tons of partners we could spend forever talking about all the different pieces these groups played in this, but just understand it really took a village to do this. So we're going to kind of jump into each of these pieces now. So the monitoring, obviously there's a fair amount of gauges that exist. So the first thing we're looking at is stream flows. So USGS gauges, FWP gauges, and DNRC gauges. So assessing what was there and where the gaps were. Additionally, a big piece is groundwater, right? So Montana Bureau of Mines and Geology looking at what wells they had within the study area, and then adding to those gaps. And this is where we're really talking about that gap filling. We added these with DNRC stream gauges. Some of them are real time and they transmit data. Some of them are not, and they just inform our models. Additionally, having gauges on irrigation infrastructure. If you're going to model human use, you need to understand irrigation. Finally, adding some groundwater wells to fill those gaps in the valley, because as you'll see today, the groundwater in the valley is a really critical component. So with that, that is all equipment that is out there monitoring. It's fairly ridiculous to try and model something this big without more data than that even, but it's hard to gauge everything. And so that's where we get into what we call discrete measurements. And these are a single point in time, someone goes out and they takes a flow measurement on a tributary or an irrigation ditch, anything like that. That measurement is a spot check we can use in our models. So at that point in time, we know the flow in this ditch was this. Did our models replicate that? And so there was a ton of effort put in to collect these discrete measurements to make sure we really comprehensively understood the valley and everything that's going on. So there's 120 of those sites, and I'll show you a map of those later. We also assessed natural loss on 8 of the tributaries, and we'll go through each of those, as well as assessing losses throughout the main stem Yellowstone itself. And we're going to go through all of these when we get into the nitty-gritty here. And then finally, a really important part is mapping of really human uses of water. So irrigation infrastructure, reservoirs, stock ponds, wells, municipal water supply. All of that stuff needs to be mapped so we can actually model it. So real quick, and let's see, hopefully my cursor is showing up here. Here is a monitoring map. So to be clear, this is the study area, but it's not the full modeling extent actually. So you can see down here, we have Livingston. So the closure of the study area would be the confluence of the Yellowstone and Shields River. As we go upstream all the way to the park, you'll see our boundary ends at the park. That does not mean the model ended at the park. We modeled everything above that point, but the human uses and everything we spent the most time on is within this study area. So I'm not going to go through all of these polka dots, but the takeaway you should have from this is it took a pile of monitoring to comprehensively understand the study area. And that should be no surprise. Hydrogeology is complicated. Hydrology is complicated. You need to have a good spread of monitoring to actually capture all the stuff you need for your model. Things that aren't shown, remotely sense evapotranspiration. So this is really getting into natural veg use and crop use. This is all remotely sensed via satellite. And then an irrigated fields data set produced by DNRC, which is now publicly available, which is a pretty fine scale detailed mapping of all the irrigated fields throughout the state of Montana. That was a critical piece for this, for modeling irrigation use. So I mentioned those discrete measurements, these spot checks, point in time. Here is a map of all those points, and you can see they are spattered all over the watershed, which is a good thing. These are those spot checks that allow us to check if our model represented a point in time properly. These also inform those natural losses and seepage, which we'll go through. And they really help us build an understanding of the water balance, especially the timing of when water is where. So a water balance, I mean, you can kind of think of it, really like a bank account. So we have our inputs and our outputs. So that box there in the middle is that study area I showed you. And we can kind of go through each of the inputs and outputs. So the inputs, the main ones are surface flow from the Yellowstone. And in this case, from our box, it's really what's coming in from the Yellowstone headwaters, as well as any tributaries coming into the study area. There's surface flow from springs and seeps. The easiest one for most people to think about is precipitation, rain and snow. There is irrigation return flows, and these can either be surface or groundwater return flows. And then finally, there's groundwater flow and mountain front recharge, all groundwater. And really, 2, 4, and 5 are all kind of tied together. It's how is that groundwater interacting with the stream system? Then your outputs would be your surface flow out, which in this case would be the Yellowstone when it meets with the Shields River. Evapotranspiration, and that's really your crop use. Surface water evaporation off any reservoirs or natural lakes. Domestic water use. Public supply, water supply and city use. So City of Livingston being the big one, Gardner as well. And then any groundwater loss or outflow. And so really the monitoring helped us capture all these different pieces and get some numbers behind them. And the modeling does all the tying of all these together and actually tells you what's going in and out of that box. All right, so the first model is what's called a hydrologic model. And so just think of this as really natural flow upstream of human use. So this is modeling, let's say Mill Creek before it comes into any human use. So what fell in that drainage? What is the flow coming out of that drainage? And then at that point, it gets run through human use, which is the next model. The beauty of these is you can put a forecast in them. So we can say, what do we expect to come out of Mill Creek during this size rain event or the future weather forecast? Excuse my French here, but the figure there on the right, which is an actual screenshot of the hydrologic model domain, those are grid cells, is badass if you're a nerd. I mean, it looks simple. It took a lot to make this actual grid, but this is what this stuff looks like, and this is awesome to have this. And it's funny, someone pointed this out in another meeting, so we code this in what's called Python, and this certainly looks like scales. But we don't need to get in the nitty-gritty on this today. This is awesome to have this piece, and just think of this model as natural, what's coming in from rain and snow and other sources. The next piece, which is my favorite, is the systems model. So we take that natural flow and now it needs to be ran through human uses. So we can actually model what happens at the bottom of these stream systems after human use. And so this is where you are accounting for every use of water, irrigation, domestic well use, city use, all of it, natural losses. And so to produce something like this, it gets very, very complicated. So the figure here on the left, this is actually Mill Creek, and you can see all the different irrigated fields are all tied to their different sources. All of this had to be mapped out for us to be able to model it properly. You couldn't just throw fields on and say, we understand it. You actually need to go in and map where are they getting their water, what's their water right. All of those pieces had to be done. The figure on the right, which looks extremely confusing as it should, is the actual systems model. And that is where you start building the relationships between all these different pieces. So you need to understand, for example, for an irrigated field, where is it pulling its water from? What's its source? Is it a stream? Is it the ground? Once it pulls it from that source, how is it using the water? What is its consumptive use? And then is there any excess water? So you can imagine water being applied on the field. If there's excess, it goes into the ground and it goes somewhere, right? So we need to model the relationship of how that now connects to another piece of the model. And so it looks confusing, and there's a classic, meme there of you look like you're crazy lining all these lines up and all these relationships, but you should, because it really is that complicated. And so we end up with this thing that allows us to run natural flows through human use and actually spit out a number that is flows in a stream after all uses of water. So this is just an example of what we get out of this. So this is 6 Mile Creek at East River Road. So it's down close to its mouth. And so you'll see 2 lines on this plot. This just happens to be flow over a 4-year period. The red is modeled flow and the blue is observed flow. And this one in particular is not calibrated. This is just our first run. But you can see what we get is the modeled flow literally comes from we send that natural flow through our systems model. It applies human use and does everything with it and spits out a flow at the mouth of 6 Mile. And you can see without any working calibration here, it actually already came really darn close, which is a great thing. And so this is how modeling kind of works. You are going to work through the process of building, refining, building, refining, building, refining until you produce something that produces your observed results. So what can you do when you have an integrated model completed and it's calibrated and it's producing observed flows well? You can do quite a few things. And this is really what we can get excited about. So we can look at on any scale we want, really, the main stem Yellowstone or even a tributary, we can look at all the ins and outs. So what's going into Mill Creek, what's going out of Mill Creek at any location, and start to understand how water's moving through that tributary. We can also look at on the scale of the main stem itself. We can look at things like base flow. So what is coming into some of these tributaries in a bad year, in a good year, and an average year, and start to understand, okay, maybe there's places where we can target restoration and other things to help headwaters. Forecasting, and we'll touch on this in the next slide. We can put weather forecasts into this thing and we can spit out both seasonal forecasts. So what is the rest of the summer going to look like? We can also look at short term. What's the next 3 days look like based off the weather forecast? And then the biggest piece here is the scenarios. So once you've constructed a systems model, you can now manipulate it. So we can say, okay, let's double the amount of wells using water in the valley over the next 10 years. What does that look like for the watershed? Let's double the population of Livingston and their water demand. What does that look like? Let's change how irrigation applies water or how irrigation uses water. What impacts does that have? And we can really start getting after real water management decisions and have a model show us what are the expected outcomes from some manipulation of the system. And yes, it is a model, so it's not going to be perfect, but it can give you a really good ballpark idea of, is this going to be a positive thing or a negative thing, and what can be done about it? So really, just think of it as you can start pulling the levers of how humans are using water in the watershed. So I'll briefly touch on forecasting. And coming into next year, we'll be pushing long-term forecasts for the Upper Yellowstone, which will be disseminated amongst as far as we can get them pretty much. But really, these are going to look at how are we looking with snowpack? What is the spring going to look like? What is the summer going to look like? So we're talking a couple months out. And really, these are based off how much snow is there at that point in time. And then we like to do it. If you look here on the figure on the right, here's where you'll land compared to other years. If you get normal rain, here's if you get an extra inch, here's if you get an extra 2 inches. So just, you know, being honest with ourselves and saying, yeah, we don't know what's going to happen in July in terms of the weather, but we can at least say, hey, if you get 2 inches of rain, it's going to look very similar to 2023. And so we can kind of let people know where we're at, really, with that starting piece being snowpack, and then as we add rain on. So in the middle of our study, we got both, you could say, lucky and unlucky, right? In 2022, there was a serious flood. And initially, the study wasn't intended to do any short-term forecasting, but immediately that flood event gave us an opportunity to collect data to inform our models to potentially be able to predict the 2022 flood event with at least a bit more warning than what was had with what was existing, which was really people saw upstream stream gauges with huge flows and had, maybe at best 18 hours to take action. So during that event, we went out and partnered with the USGS to collect a ton of high water marks within the study area. So Livingston's up here, Gardner's down here. These high water marks are going to allow us to hopefully push our model to be able to understand that event and predict that event and maybe give a 3-day warning, which if you ask folks out there who, especially those who are in the thick of it, 3-day warning is a heck of a lot better than 18 hours. So that'll be a piece we'll continue to refine and push out, which is a really exciting thing that, you never look at a flood event like that and look at the positives. One of the positives that came out of it is we were able to collect the data while we're working on this model to be able to do this stuff. So timeline. We just completed the BOR grant, and that's all submitted, and that was the data collection, the construction of those models, tying those models together. And now we're in the phase of starting to run those model scenarios. So looking at future growth in the watershed, looking at different drought actions that can be taken and can they have positive impacts during drought to help some of these tributaries, and look at really any water management scenario. And as I just mentioned, rolling into forecasting next spring, seasonal forecasting being those monthly forecasts, and then short-term forecasting after that. Now the fun stuff, at least what I think is the fun stuff. We'll see what you guys think. So this is a mountain of data, a ton of data. I'm not even gonna be able to show you a fraction of what we've done. This is just to give you some of the stuff we think is more fun off the bat. There's going to be more and more outreach, fact sheets, things coming your way, that as we go through all of this process will bring more light to some of the things we found. So we're not going to get into the weeds of the nerd stuff today. I'm going to focus on the cool stuff, and this is the drinking from the fire hose part, so be ready. But first, disclaimer, all the data you're about to see is provisional. What that means is it needs to go through DNRC's internal review, and then the final numbers will be published. This doesn't mean the numbers are wrong. It just means they need to go through review. But really, today, focus on the trends and relationships we see in these numbers and not the actual numbers themselves. They're certainly ballpark, but it's the relationships and trends we want to highlight here. So the first thing we're going to look at is main stem synoptics. So what is a synoptic? A synoptic is when you go out and you measure every single thing going into a stream. In this case, the main stem Yellowstone River. So we went out, we measured every single tributary. We measured every single piece of irrigation going in and out. And you're basically, when you do that, you have solved for the remaining piece being what's going into the river via groundwater, which we can't measure. And so we would measure 2 locations on the Yellowstone River and measure everything in between. And by simple math, you get, okay, there's this much coming in. Here's all the extra tributary and irrigation water. And here's how much was at the bottom of that section of the Yellowstone River. So the leftover piece is how much water it gained or lost to groundwater. And so these are really comprehensive efforts. You'll see the scale, which we did them here in a minute. But what this is really showing us is it's giving us a viewpoint, a snapshot at one point in time into how groundwater is interacting with the river. All right, so this map here is funky because the watershed is weird shaped and we're in the horizontal presentation world. So down here at the bottom right is Livingston, and then over here on the left is Gardner. So flow is going this way. Each of these highlighted sites is where we measured the main stem Yellowstone. So you can see we started at the USGS gauge in Corbin Springs. Our next measurement was at the Carbella Bridge, the Tom Miner Road Bridge. So what you're going to see on the next slide is what happened in between all of these different points. And the number you're going to see is going to be how much water was going in or out of the river via groundwater. So all the surface water has been corrected for and accounted for. We're just seeing how much groundwater is going in and out of the river. So these numbers are an average of many, many of these runs. So again, these are a snapshot in time. We do them one point in time. We do them in April. We do them in September. What was really, really interesting about the Upper Yellowstone is the behavior basically didn't change between these reaches. These reaches did the same thing almost every single time, which is unusual and kind of cool at the same time. So quickly running through this. So for example, that one I pointed out, the USGS Corbin Springs gauge at Tom Miner Road Bridge, we have 47.2 CFS. This means on average, 47.2 CFS is flowing into the Yellowstone River through this reach. And that is not too surprising if you know the geology of the area. You have Yankee Jim Canyon and all that groundwater gets forced up and into the river. That makes sense. As we work our way downstream, so Tom Miner Ridge to Reedfly Farms, we see a little bit of a bigger gain. It's gaining 84.8 CFS on average. Reedfly Farms to Mill Creek Road Bridge, we see 115.1 CFS. And then we see our first interesting thing, which is from the Mill Creek Road Bridge to Loch Levin fishing access, was losing on average 130 CFS. So when it's red here negative, it means it was losing to groundwater. It's interesting. It's also not that surprising, right? The valley is much wider here. So the groundwater is likely below the river surface. So you would expect water to be leaving the river at any point in time. So we work our way downstream. So Loch Levin to Pine Creek Road Bridge, we see a gain of 96.3 CFS, which if you know that area, there's a lot of springs, groundwater springs that come in. That is not a surprise. Then we see, and this one we don't have much of an explanation for because it's just weird. Pine Creek to PMD Ranch, we saw a pretty substantial loss of 71 CFS. Who knows? And well, it's one of those things where we would expect a gain because everything's pinching up into Carter's Bridge. But we saw a loss. It's probably related to limestone, some weird aquifer stuff going on, but just a really interesting result. And then finally, we see PMD Ranch to Carter's Bridge, a huge gain of groundwater. That should not be a surprise. So where the spring creeks all come in, all that water gets forced up before it goes through that notch point into Carter's Bridge and eventually Livingston. So those numbers were total for those reaches, but you could probably tell those reaches were not the same length. So if we look at this in a total CFS per mile, which is comparing apples to apples now, things kind of make sense. So we see kind of the same level-ish of gain until we get to Mill Creek, which isn't too surprising. We see that area of big loss. And then we see two areas, which are those areas where those spring creeks are coming in, of substantial groundwater gain. And this is, again, really important to understand that clearly groundwater is a source of water for the Yellowstone River, and groundwater is typically colder. So this is just showing us, I guess, this stuff is really, really important, and it clearly plays a role. So, tributary natural loss. So this one, exact same thing as those synoptics, but instead we go out to the creeks. We go out to all the tributaries, and we go do the exact same thing. We go measure the top of that tributary where it comes out of the mountains and the bottom at the mouth, and we measure any stream coming into it and any irrigation going out. And what we get is how much water is being gained or lost to the ground. In this case, almost all of them were losing. So we'll jump into some of the data here. And this table looks like a lot, and it is a lot. But we'll go through it quickly. So you can see we're broken up by which tributary. We have the average total loss. So this is over a bunch of these events. The average percent loss, and then the highest percent loss. And the main takeaway here is most of these creeks are losing water. And this should not be a surprise if you know the valley, especially the east side. They come out of the mountains and they hit the Yellowstone Valley, and it's extremely coarse sediment. Very coarse glacial sediment, cobbles. I mean, you're really moving water. Like Mill Creek, you're dumping water over footballs. So you were going to lose quite a bit of that water to the ground. And so we saw substantial losses on the east side. The east side averaged 63% loss, and this is non-diverted water. So water coming in, you account for everything diverted, and then what's left? Less than half of it was making it to the mouth just because of natural loss. This is a really important thing to understand when we talk about things like drought management plans and actions that can be taken, because this is a natural thing that you're going to have to deal with on these systems. So again, this table is a lot, and we're not going to go into the crazy details because I'm looking at the clock and I'm like, we've got a lot to do. So we'll keep rolling here. We're going to kind of summarize human uses now, and we're not going to go into insane detail. We'll just kind of paint a broad brush here. So irrigation in the valley, you can see here's a map of all the irrigated fields in yellow throughout the valley. There's 27,000 acres irrigated within the study area. About 10,000 of those acres is irrigated with water from the Yellowstone River itself. And about 17,000 acres is irrigated with water from springs or tributaries and not the main stem itself. And then about 1,000 of those acres has shared sources where they can either take from the river or a tributary. Ditches and seepage. So this is highlighting this map here. All these points were measurements taken. You can see the highlighted green is ditches. And so one piece of our model is understanding these irrigation systems leak, and that water goes somewhere. And so we needed to measure that. We're not going to jump into the numbers on these today, but you can see we performed quite a bit of seepage measurements throughout the valley, so we could actually properly account for that. And we really focused on the two biggest systems in the valley, which is the Park Branch Canal and the Paradise Canal. So understanding those larger systems, which have enough seepage that it really can make a difference. And so what this gives us is one piece of irrigation return flows, which we talked about earlier, which is that water seeps into the ground, it goes to the groundwater, it goes somewhere. And so by measuring at the point of seepage, we know, okay, it went into the ground here. Now we can try to figure out the timing and where it's actually showing up, and we'll get into some of those pieces here. So another thing is lakes, ponds, and reservoirs. And this is an evolving data set. So again, focus less on the numbers and focus more on the kind of percents and trends here. So 193 total reservoirs, and you can see broken up by their different uses and types. So most of them are domestic, fishery, or stock uses. 32 are for irrigation, 20 are for stock, which would be livestock, and then 22 of them overlap with those uses, and then 9 are for other. But you can see we have a very good spread throughout the valley, which is not that surprising again. But this is a piece we had to model. We had to understand all of these because what do lakes, ponds, and reservoirs do? They experience evaporation, and that is a consumptive use. Once that evaporation happens, it is out of the watershed. Domestic and public water supply. So this is one of the most challenging things to account for. And so you're seeing a map here of the total wells for domestic and public water supply systems throughout the entire study area. And there's 3,600 total. You can see it's absolutely polka dotted like crazy all over. Out of those numbers, 3,516 are individual wells. So you can think about this as a domestic well, somebody's house. And then 65 are public water supply systems. The most important piece of use when you're looking at wells is actually not the indoor use, because that's not very consumptive. It's the lawn and garden use. That is where, plants use water. It transpires, it is gone, it leaves the watershed. We need to account for that. So with that came figuring out the average, for lack of better terms, the average lawn size tied to these systems, because that's how we actually model that consumptive use. So you can see on average, the individual wells had a size of 0.19 acres of lawn irrigated with that system, and the public water supply had an average size of 0.1 acres, which includes the city of Livingston, which is probably why that's a bit smaller due to the lot sizes. But this is, it's hard to say what went into this data set, but a lot of this was hand mapping and determining of these numbers because we're trying to account for those uses. So again, broad brush here. So we're going to look at consumption within our model cube here, which is the Upper Yellowstone Watershed. So we're going to look at each of these. This is a annual water consumption in volume. And so you can see the first one we're looking at is what's called past Carter's Bridge, because we're using the gauge there. So this means annually 1.2 million acre feet past that gauge, which if you account for the total water above that point, that's almost 83% of the water in the watershed is flowing out of the watershed via the Yellowstone River, which again is not that surprising because even in a bad year, when the Yellowstone's very low, it's still 700 plus CFS, which is still substantial compared to other systems. The next piece is field evapotranspiration, which includes both precipitation and irrigation. And this is plant and crop use, with crop use being the dominant. And this is about 250,000 acre feet annually, which comes to close to 17% of the water in the watershed, which is remarkable. And we'll kind of talk about that later, why that's interesting. Then we look at the other uses. So this is that household lawn and garden use. So for domestic wells alone, we see just under 1,000 acre feet and a sliver of a percent of the total water within the watershed. City of Livingston, similar, but what's really interesting here is to look at the relationship between these two. So if we're looking City of Livingston versus domestic well users, which are all the wells throughout the valley, the city uses about half the water, which is substantial. So just that relationship alone is very interesting to think about. And you can think about some of the stresses in the valley, which are, more domestic wells going in and growth in the valley. That's where some stress is going to show up. Finally, lake evaporation, about 6,000 acre feet annually. So the big takeaway here is these bottom ones are humans. And so no surprises here that irrigation is most of the water use. That is well documented throughout all of Montana. That's just how it goes. They're growing crops, they're raising cattle, they're doing all of that. That's your predominant water use. That being said, the ones that are changing the most are the domestic and city use as those populations grow. But all of that said, 83% of the water is flowing out, which is really a testament to the Yellowstone headwaters is incredible. It provides a ton of water, so much that you can irrigate 27,000 acres, have 3,600 wells and 2 cities, and still have 83% of that water not get used. I mean, it really is an incredible resource. Okay, so now we're going to jump into some of the fun stuff. I'm going to fly through this stuff to get it done. So we're going to look at what I think's more interesting here, which is some of the groundwater data. So quick context, we're going to look at a couple wells. So here's Carter's Bridge. Here's the town of Prey. And then here's the Mill Creek monitoring well. It's right by the mouth of Mill Creek. It's very close to Mill Creek, 250 feet away from the creek itself, and about 120 feet deep. And these ones always take a minute to pop up. So we are looking at a hydrograph since 2022 of this Mill Creek well. And what you're seeing on the y-axis is depth to water. So the higher that line is, the closer the groundwater is to the ground surface. And so we could see some trends over the past 4 years. You can see a huge spike in June of 2022, which is the flood. But you can just see some pretty normal looking groundwater hydrographs with maybe a slight upward trend, which would maybe lead you to think, is groundwater up in the valley since 2022? But we need to think about this well in the context of it. And it'll take a minute because it's a big, here we go. What really influences this well in particular is Mill Creek itself. So you can see on here, we have that same yellow is the groundwater table. And the blue is flow in Mill Creek plotted on the same time scale. And what you can see is these slopes and spikes in the groundwater are very, very, very tied to changes in flow in Mill Creek. And this is a no-brainer when you think about the natural loss we talked about. Mill Creek loses a lot of water naturally. So obviously a well around Mill Creek is going to be super influenced by the flow in Mill Creek. So this would indicate, like, yeah, this well is maybe not a good indicator of groundwater in the valley. It's indicating losses from Mill Creek. Which leads us to, let's look at a different well we monitored. So here's that again, Mill Creek well here at the bottom, town of Prey, Carter's Bridge up here. This is on Paradise Valley Ranch. It's a monitoring well that's 1.5 miles away from the Yellowstone River, within the influence zone of the Park Branch Canal system, and it is much deeper. So let's see what this well looks like. So same thing, you can see we are much deeper here. We are in the 140s depth from ground surface to the water. And again, as this line is higher, that water is closer to the ground surface. And so here you can see in 2022, we had a peak, we go down. 2023 was a decent water year, so things came up. But then you can see a downward trend over the last couple of years, which should be no surprise. The watershed's been going through drought, but I would say, given what we've seen with the groundwater and how important it is for the river, this is concerning, right? This is way out in the valley. This is probably a really good representation of the conditions of groundwater, and there's a downward trend. That's something to raise alarm. We're talking 10 feet lower. And when you think about the scale of the valley, like, that's a lot of water. A lot of water. So this is a piece of monitoring, and I'm not trying to be negative Nancy here because I'm going to bring it around to some optimism, but this is certainly a downward trend. Again, to remind you here, because I'm about to show them. So Mill Creek is right by Mill Creek and right by the Yellowstone. Paradise Valley Ranch monitoring well is away. I'm going to plot them on the same chart here. Blue is that Paradise Valley Ranch away from the river. Yellow is Mill Creek. And you can see Mill Creek hasn't changed a whole lot, whereas we see way out in the valley, the groundwater has certainly gone down. This is definitely grounds for concern. And again, not a surprise given the drought conditions. But me being me, we're going to be a little more optimistic here. You will notice something interesting about the Paradise Valley Ranch well. So see, especially in 2023 when the aquifer is higher, we see some really bizarre behavior here. What is that? So we are now zoomed in on that same graph. This is 2023. The red is your groundwater elevation. So the higher that is, the higher the groundwater is. The blue is the temperature of that groundwater. So you can see the groundwater starts coming up in May. No surprises, right? Runoff started, water started moving throughout the valley. We would expect things to go up. During that period, it also cooled down. Again, not surprising, it's snow melt being moved throughout the valley. Then we see these bumps, which are the elevation going up and down and up and down. At the same time, we see the temperature. Anytime that elevation goes down, the temperature drops. Anytime it goes up, the temperature goes up. What is that telling us? That is telling us there is some other influence, a different source of water is influencing the groundwater elevation. And in this case, it's irrigation. That is within the Park Branch Canal system. So that is seepage and irrigation return flows causing the aquifer to go up and down. And if you look at these peaks, because there's 3 of them, they correlate very well to flow in the canal when they're haying. So the first one happens right around the 4th of July. Groundwater goes down, and it's because the canal cut back their use because people were cutting hay. And as soon as they turn back on, the groundwater goes up. This is awesome because we just talked about how we're concerned about, groundwater and its ties to the river. And this is showing a human use that's providing potentially a benefit. Can we use that as a tool? If we dive a little bit further and try to understand, okay, that is the groundwater going up and down related to the canal. Where does that groundwater go? So on this map, we have Pine Creek here in the middle. Again, Carter's Bridge up at the top. Here's that monitoring well that we just looked at that data from. Then here's Armstrong Spring Creek, which is a natural spring creek, but it's also heavily influenced by irrigation return flows. So this is a confusing, but probably the coolest plot, in my opinion, of all time for me, because it's just awesome. We have that same red line as that groundwater elevation. So you can see those same humps. This is 2023. So again, the higher it is, the closer to ground surface. The green is flow in Armstrong Spring Creek. So it's no longer groundwater. This is actual surface water flow. We see a pretty expected trend initially in the Spring Creek. It spikes up during runoff and maintains that spike, but then it drops and it has these 3 distinct peaks in its flow. And so that's the flow went up and then it went down and it went up and it went down. If we start looking at the timing of the groundwater peak and the timing of the peak in the Spring Creek's flow, and we look at those 3 humps, they line up very, very well in terms of time between the groundwater peak and the spring flow peak. And it comes in a range of 20 to 23 days. This is awesome. This is groundwater that's going in from irrigation. It stays in the ground for 20 plus days. And then it comes out in Armstrong Spring Creek, which many of you probably know is, in terms of fishing, as good as it gets. It's a cool water, great source for the fishery. We've just found a human tie to something important and a benefit we want. That is awesome. That is something to be optimistic about, because now the question is, what can we do with the canal system to promote aquifer health when we have water available? We understand these ties now. How can we use that? So key takeaways: groundwater surface water interaction in the valley is weird on a fine scale. You can think of that example of that loss of water down closer to Carter's Bridge that we don't have a good explanation for. But luckily, if we look at a bigger scale, it's very predictable. As I said, it never changed. The behavior is very similar. That's a good thing for us thinking about what we can do. Groundwater levels are critical for the health of the stream systems and the river itself. And you saw that with all the gains to the main stem Yellowstone. That's cold, good water for the fishery. This is really important for the health. The valley groundwater levels are down, and that's because of the drought, and they're down quite a bit. Tributaries experience significant natural loss, something that will always be a problem. Most human water use is irrigation. That's not a surprise. But again, even with that, the Yellowstone headwaters provide such an impressive quantity of water. It's amazing what it can sustain in terms of human use. And finally, understanding irrigation return flows can aid water management. That's that last piece we touched on. We just understand a tie there. What can we do about it? So takeaways from the study: a lot of data was collected. There's More to come on water use. This is going to be continually improved. This is luckily not a model that sits on the shelf. DNRC will always be operating this model and improving it. We have really built this tie and understood like the big thing here is surface water, groundwater interaction. It's critical. Huge takeaway is an integrated model exists. And I will tell you, it is one of a kind. No other place within Montana really has anything comparable in what this model can do. It is incredible we have this available now. So let's go use it. It is a tool. Let's look at future scenarios. Let's come up with ideas. Let's test things. Restoration, all of those pieces can be brought into this and looked at now. More outreach than today. Again, today was just getting people familiar with what's going on, what's been done, and I showed you a fraction of what we have. And finally, a huge takeaway, and you saw all the different places that were measured, all the different work that was done, the passion in the valley. You could tell from folks living in the valley to recreating in the valley to ranching in the valley. Everybody cares a lot. That's evident by the access we were able to get. And that is a good thing that we have that energy. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. This just exists, so it's on the recording so people can get an idea of what's coming. As Danielle mentioned when we started, working with the drought focus group on what's coming in these drought years and what can be done in terms of water use, irrigation, domestic wells, to help things out in times of drought. What actions can humans take to actually make a difference on the ground? Working with the city of Livingston to model their system in much more detail and help them look at what they can do differently to operate in a more water conservation mindset. Look at the headwaters. What are those tributaries that a little bit of restoration would go a long way? We can go identify those. Understanding that Park Branch Canal system, what can they do? They have a huge influence. They divert the most water. We saw that they're super tied to the aquifer. What can they do to benefit the aquifer, which, as we know, benefits the other systems? Those forecasts coming out in the future. And then finally getting all these results published, which there will be a report, but really fact sheets that talk about all these different things, making all the data publicly available. And most importantly, continuing to do this. What do people want to see? We have the tool now. Let's use it. We're not going to put it on the shelf. So any ideas ongoing, we're going to do them. I could go on and on and on with the thank yous. Upper Yellowstone Watershed Group, all those partners, all the irrigators that worked with us, all the landowners that gave us access, the entire DNRC nerd team. I am lucky enough to be the one presenting this because it's a big accomplishment, but it's probably because I talk the loudest rather than actually being qualified. But real special thank yous to, and I hope she's on here, Sarah Malloy, who's no longer at DNRC, but this would not have happened without her. And then the one and only Rhea Gordon. She was the field tech. She now works at DNRC full time. She did a huge amount, like ridiculous amount of work out measuring and doing all this stuff we needed to actually be able to do it. Without her, we would not be here. And I'm under the hour. I talked too much. Hopefully people learned something and now we can do questions.
Well done, John. Thank you very much. That's a tremendous amount of information in a very short period of time. A lot for everyone to take in. But yes, we will open this up to questions. This is really exciting. First of its kind study in the state of Montana, cutting edge data. I think it's going to be an example for everyone to follow. If you want to come off mute and ask your question in person, feel free to, or type something into the chat if you would prefer. So I'll just open it up.
I've got a question. I was going to leave space for others. Thanks for this very inspiring presentation. I think it's difficult to communicate how science is so relevant, especially to those that work on the ground. And I walked away not feeling overwhelmed, but I feel invigorated. And I appreciate your prompt to figure out how else can we use this tool. And I think what's important for us in my work is, how do we use this tool to change behaviors at the individual level in terms of, climate change and how we're adapting, and then, directing our messaging and outreach with limited resources. There was another presentation. So my questions, I've got a couple. There was another presentation with Climate Analyzer and some of the walking ecology consulting work. And I think that this data feeds into that as, you know, I was listening to flood predictions and kind of how they consolidate that. I'm seeing you nod, so I assume that that's correct. And then like one of the levers to pull some of the work that we're doing with the Community Wildfire Protection Plan and looking at impacts to our water systems, watersheds, surface water, drinking water. Their missing element is how does it impact our local habitats and ecosystems, maybe on the more non-human elements. But is there a lever you can pull there for not just flood, but also wildfire?
That's a great question, and absolutely. So that runoff model, one of the things it considers is what's the cover in those headwaters? Is it timber? You know, what's the vegetation? All of that, which means you can pull the lever and say, well, what if that whole area is burned? And there's actually examples within the model that have been burned, Fridley Creek, 6 Mile Creek, where we can see that. And so absolutely, we can go into those tributaries and say, well, let's see if we change the parameters that control that piece and make it look more like a burned area rather than a forested area and see the impacts. Which again you wouldn't be too surprised, right? They would be a much more abrupt runoff, but we have a model that can show us that and give us numbers behind that and how bad is it and how important is the total acreage burned to that. You know, is it going to be, is a big fire, what's a big fire in terms of stream flow, right? How much burned area does it take to have an issue? So completely, yeah. And that's a great question.
Awesome. I know it's the top of the hour. If people have to go, I understand, but John has also agreed to stay a little longer. So if any of you have a question, please, yeah, feel free to jump in now and we'll keep it going a little longer.
And again, this won't be the last you're hearing from me. So we'll be pushing, you know, fact sheets on all these different pieces so that, because it is hard to disseminate this much information. So, you know, here's a fact sheet on irrigation in the valley. Here's a fact sheet on natural loss, and get those out to folks so they have a simple, here's the summary of that piece of it. And then, like, again, wide open to what people want to see in terms of scenarios, and let's start pulling levers.
That's awesome. Thank you, John, for your presentation today. We'll be sure to share that information as it comes out from you. And we'll know the Watershed Group will also be a good source of that information. So everyone sign up for their newsletters, sign up for ours. We'll keep this going. And thank you all for joining us today and have a great afternoon. Bye.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.